Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we're going from 1000 to 2000 ELO and chess.com rapid games, where I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. And today we have another Caro Kann Defense. One of my favourite openings, and my opponent goes for the knight to c3 classical variation, I suppose. Now, of course, the game started with d4, and I played c6. If my opponent were to play in typical queen's pawn style with like c4 or knight to f3, then I would probably transpose to a Slav defense. However, I like to start with the move c6 because I prefer a Caro Kann. It's just a nice little move order. And also, I released a video recently where my opponent went bishop to f4, and there's a really nice anti-London idea with queen to b6. Going after the weak b2 pawn and the weak d4 pawn, because queen c1 can't really be played because it hangs the pawn. However, my opponent transposes back into the Caro Kann, and here we have two main options. Either we take, my opponent takes back, and then you can play bishop f5 or knight to f6. I prefer going knight to f6 and going into the Tartakower. I also have the option of going g6, known as the Gurganitsa system, which is a bit more aggressive, I would say, and we essentially try to claim this knight is misplaced on the c3 square. However, I know a lot of you watching my videos like the Tartakower, so let's play a Tartakower. de4, of course, knight e4 is the only move that makes sense. I suppose you could play the move f3 and try to gambit a pawn, although that probably isn't too concerning for us. On f3, I'm trying to think if we can play something else, like maybe a knight f6 move. Like, for example, if f3, knight f6, fe4, maybe we have... yeah, we probably have e5, and have to take, knight to g4. I'll show you after the game, if I remember. But knight takes e4, and yeah, you can either play bishop to f5, which I don't personally like, or you can play knight to f6, the Tartakower variation. And this is typically considered to be a very solid line. I think that Gukesh, obviously the world champion, he used to play this line very frequently. I think as recently as like 2022, 2023, in like, you know, actual tournament over-the-board games. So this is a very solid line. And the point is that we offer to double our pawns, right? You can technically play g takes f6, but it's pretty dubious. And the point is, if knight takes f6, e takes f6, yes, we have doubled pawns, but our f-pawn is actually really useful at taking away squares for white, especially, you know, putting a knight on f3. It can't really advance with our pawn on f6. My opponent, however, goes knight to g3, which is quite a rare continuation, probably because it's not very good. And I believe the move here is h5, trying to play h4 and kick the knight back to e2. My opponent will most likely respond with h4, of course stopping us from playing h4 ourselves. And there, I think bishop g4 makes sense, because I suppose one of the benefits of the knight on g3 is that it takes away the f5 square from our bishop, right? Which is the more natural developing square for the bishop. However, if h4 is played, bishop g4 makes a lot more sense. Let's say h4, bishop g4, because there's no h3 to kick our bishop away, because the pawn is already committed to the h4 square. And if a move like h4, bishop to g4 and f3, that's very weakening to the g3 square in particular, and we can probably respond with a move like queen d6 there, ignoring the threat on our bishop and going after the knight. However, my opponent goes knight to f3, and of course h4 looks like it should be the move. The knight is not controlling this square particularly well because our rook already controls that square, and that should kick the knight back to the e2 square, which not only forces the knight back, but more importantly, makes it difficult to develop the light-squared bishop. If the light-squared bishop can't get out, then white can't castle. And if white can't castle, then his king is stranded in the center of the board. Also, upon knight e2, bishop to g4 looks very good. whilst the knight isn't pinned to the queen is not defending the knight. So if a move like bishop g4 and my opponent goes h3, we could take and double the pawns. On that same note, though, there may be a better way to exploit this knight by first playing the move h3 ourselves. If my opponent takes, I assume we can take with the bishop, and if we get a bishop trade here, I mean the knight's hit, knight f4 attacks the rook, defends the knight, we can probably drop the rook back, and we can't castle kingside, but we have an open h-file against a weak h2 pawn, and my opponent can't really justify castling kingside anymore. On h3, if g3, then bishop to g4 comes with a little bit of venom. However, even if I go bishop g4 immediately, my opponent could play the move knight to e5, sidestepping the attack and putting pressure on my bishop. And I think I'd rather not trade the bishop off, at least not yet, so worth taking into consideration. I would like to develop this knight, but I also don't want to block my bishop's development just yet. I'd also like to play e6, but I don't want to block this bishop's development just yet. So h3, I think, makes sense. And I'm admittedly not entirely sure. Maybe white can play knight f4, but taking looks pretty good. I'm not 100% convinced. It'll be interesting to see what the computer recommends in this position. However, I think I like the move h3, mainly because if my opponent gets to play h3, this pawn may be a weakness in the long run, especially if a bishop can get to g5 and the bishop and knight can team up on the h-pawn. And with the white pawn on h3, if I try to justify losing the h-pawn as a pawn sacrifice, my rook and bishop staring at the h3 pawn isn't all that impressive because it's supported by a pawn on g2. So I think pushing the pawn is probably the right idea. But again, we'll see what the computer has to say afterwards. It's also worth noting that by doing this, we split white's pawn structure into 3 different islands, which is typically not good. We have 2 pawn islands, of course, 2 groups of 3. My opponent has 1 group of 4 and 2 groups of 1. We should look in the future to exploit that weakness. Okay, knight g3, trying to develop. Taking the bishop is very tempting. We also don't have to take the bishop. We could play a move like bishop to g4, backing out of the position, but h3, yeah, I don't really want to allow that. Alternatively, we could play a move like knight to d7. We could even consider a move like queen to d5, applying pressure to the knight and preparing knight to d7. There's quite a few options here. We could even play e6, just preparing to develop our dark squared bishop. What else is there? Queen a5 wouldn't be the most ridiculous move ever. I mean, bishop d2, maybe we can justify it with queen b6. However, bishop c3 looks pretty solid, so I don't think there's any need for that. Should we take? If king takes, that should be good for us. If rook takes, that should also be good for us. If bishop takes, knight takes, it's my only issue, I think. It still should be good, though. And my rook is probably better on h8 than if we trade on h3 and my rook has to come to h3. So yeah, let's take the bishop. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I would really appreciate it. My opponent takes with the king. Okay, so I assume his plan is to go king to g2 and try to defend the king side, but I mean, missing the g-pawn is a big problem. It's a big problem, and I like the look of the move queen to d5. I don't really see an issue with it. Of course, moves like e6 are fine, moves like knight d7 or knight a6 are also probably fine, but I like this move just because it centralizes the queen, applies pressure to the rook and the knight, Also discourages my opponent from playing king to g2 because it would pin the knight to the king. He does it anyway. We don't have an immediate threat on the knight, but, it's not comfortable to be pinned like this. And there's no c4 because the bishop no longer controls the c4 square because we traded the bishops. Now what will we do? I think e6 makes the most sense by far. Let's play it. There's a good chance I castle queenside and try and target the d-pawn and maybe double the rooks on the h-file. Maybe at some point I throw this pawn to g5 and g4. Wow, that's a bold move. That's a very bold move. I mean, immediately you should see the fact that h2 is only defended by the king because the knight is pinned to the king by our queen. So knight g4, for example, would threaten rook or knight takes h2 because the knight wouldn't be able to take back. However, I think my opponent could just play h3 if I go knight to g4, and I don't really have a good follow-up. I could try and justify it with like knight f2, king f2, and rook to h3, but I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense. I think my opponent may be trying to play rook to e5 to kick my queen out. So knight d7 and bishop to d6 both stop that. I think I prefer knight d7. Well, knight bd7. Yeah, let's play it. I don't think it really matters, in fairness. Bishop g5 is never really concerning. I think if my opponent wants to... Like, bishop g5, it is hit by the queen, but the knight does defend the bishop, and obviously if my queen takes, the knight is no longer pinned. Bishop g5, bishop d6 looks pretty nice. If takes, I could take with the knight or the pawn, to be fair. Okay, queen d3, potentially preparing the move c4. Bishop d6, c4. My queen doesn't have a whole lot of squares to go to. She doesn't have that many options. I could play knight b6, trying to stop b4, but then my opponent has rook e5, because my knight no longer controls that square. I suppose if knight b6, rook e5, I could play queen to d7 and prepare bishop to d6 with tempo. Although maybe my opponent will try and go rook to g5, which looks like a decent square for the rook, to be fair. I could play a slightly more passive bishop e7 and meet c4 with queen to d6. I don't want to do that, really. I could queenside castle. c4. I could rotate via a5. I mean, I could go bishop d6, c4, queen to a5, bishop d2, queen c7, c5, bishop f4. c5 should be a mistake in those lines because my opponent probably won't be able to play the move d5 here, and this pawn should become a permanent weakness. So I think I should play this. Let's do it. Bishop d6. As long as d5 can't come with too much of a problem, it's defended currently 1, 2, 3, and when my queen moves 4 times. Yeah, okay, he goes for c4, clearly the plan. I don't think we really have an option other than going to a5. I'd love to take the knight and then go queen to h5, but we don't have time. So let's go queen a5. We have to be aware that the e-pawn is pinned to the king, so there could be ideas of d5. Okay, my opponent goes for the line I was expecting. I think we probably have to go queen c7. Nothing else looks like it really makes any sense. Queen b6, of course, just gets us forked. d5's... Well, actually, it could be played. It could be played here. Okay, he doesn't play it. Interesting. Bishop c3. Well, this seems like a perfect opportunity to castle. Probably queenside. There is an argument to be made for king to f8. But I don't think I want to do that. I think I want to castle queenside. C5 is a move at some point, maybe. But for now, let's unpin our e-pawn. I do think my opponent should have gone for d5 here, which I think we would have been okay. Moves like knight c5 look like they do a decent job of defending, because we hit the queen and defend the pawn. But yeah, the bishop on c3, I mean, I'm not really sure what purpose it serves, to be honest. Maybe the bishop coming to g5 looks more active, to be fair. But we don't have an immediate attack. We have a few pieces pointed towards our opponent's king, but there's no way through just yet. Knight to g4, however, actually makes way more sense now. Because previously, I said that h3 was a problem. However, if knight g4, h3, I have knight takes f2, king takes f2, bishop takes g3, supported by the queen, which would be a knockout. Okay, knight g5, attacking f7. I mean, I assume rook f8 is relatively forced. I could go knight to g4 and counterattack, though. Which, now that I think about it, might be more accurate. Knight g4, knight takes f7, rook takes h2 check. King f3. Then I can come here with a pin on the knight. If knight here, knight takes check. King g1. Rook f8. Knight takes d6 check. Queen takes d6. I have pressure on f2. That should be winning. Okay, what else can my opponent do? He could play h3. But then we can... Oh no, we can't, because the queen's now defending. Here, h3. Oh, that's complicated. And then knight defends the h3 square as well. So that's not quite as clear cut. h3... I don't think I can make that work. So maybe we just have to take a more defensive approach. We could make a case for knight to c5. A very fancy looking move. The idea being our queen defends f7 and we hit the queen. Knight c5, if he takes, I can take on g3 with a discovered attack. However, the queen can take back. So it doesn't work. Interesting idea, though. I don't really want to play that. Bishop g3? I also don't really want to play that. This gets us forked. Knight f8? Queen defends f7. We also maintain this pressure. Knight f8, the knight's going to come to g6. That looks pretty good, actually. As strange a move as this seems, I actually think it's quite strong. I know I've spent a while on that move, and maybe I shouldn't have. Knight to f8 is definitely a bit of a dank move, I think you could say. But to be fair, one more move and we get knight to g6, and it isn't exactly clear how white's going to defend everything. Yeah, this makes sense, of course. I could take, but... Oh, wait, no, take... let me think. Taking makes sense, because the knight can't take, because h2 hangs, right? So probably queen takes. Knight g6. Of course, knight f4 doesn't come with a threat of forking the queen anymore, but it still looks very threatening. Let's do it. There is a chance my opponent just blunders and takes with the knight, but I doubt it, considering his play so far has been pretty solid. Okay, yeah, he doesn't blunder that. Let's play knight g6. We do have to watch out for moves like d5, especially considering g7 is relatively weak, but opening the g file does not seem like a good option for the white pieces particularly. I Yeah, I don't think that's too much for threat. Okay, that's interesting. c5. Very committal. Very committal, because it weakens this pawn massively. We could take the knight, but I don't think that's a good option. That just helps white. We could give a check. You could just drop the bishop back. And then we can rotate the bishop to f6 even, which is a pretty good square. I mean, I did say this pawn is weak. It can't advance to d5 anymore because it just lost its support. And while my bishop was good on the d6 square, it's going to be pretty effective here. Okay, my opponent pushes b4, trying to play b5. I don't think that's too concerning. Again, we can jump in with a check, but I'm not sure what we accomplish. Here. I don't really want to take it. Rook h4 looks like an interesting move. Rook h4 looks really interesting. Putting pressure on the queen and the d4 pawn, right? Lining up both my rooks with the d4 pawn. Also actually preparing a double up. Ooh. Okay, well, this should immediately be obvious as a threat. However, I don't know if we can make it happen because f7 hangs in a lot of lines. Rook f4 also looks decent. Rook d to h8 looks good, though. Rook h1 looks like the only move. Knight f1 can be played, but I don't think that works. Yeah, because my queen also gets uncovered then. I'm not sure if this is necessarily the best approach, but I honestly don't see how white defends himself. He may be trying to just ignore the threats and play queen takes f7, but I don't believe in that. Yeah, no, he doesn't do that. Okay, we can give a knight check. Or we can play rook to f4. We could again take here to threaten this. Here. I don't see where our threat is, though. So, okay. Knight check. King g1 looks forced. Ooh, knight h3? Yeah, no, that looks really strong. That looks really strong. Yeah, let's play that. The point is, you'll see in a minute, that after king g1, knight h3, king g2, rook f4, we hit the queen, but our knight is now also watching f2 as well as f4, whereas on g6 it was only watching the f4 square. So that comes with an added threat of playing rook takes f2, and I don't think that that can be defended. We're really taking advantage of the fact that my opponent has no g-pawn. That is essentially his downfall, and that was sparked all the way back on like move 6 or 7 when I went h5, h4, h3. Right? So it's a long-term advantage. And this should just win the game. Rook f4. And my pieces work together beautifully to coordinate an attack on the white king. My opponent's bishop isn't doing a whole lot. Neither is his knight. His rook is just trapped in the corner. It's a very sad rook. Here we can win the queen. And it's even worse than that because we can play queen to f4 check. And we will just smother the white king. I suppose the game isn't over quite yet. You still need to show a little bit of finesse. Queen e3 looks pretty good. Hitting the bishop, the pawn, threatening an invasion on the second rank. Queen here, rook here. We don't actually have any checks. We don't have any checks. Bishop h4 is tempting to try and get rid of this knight, to give us the light squares. Although I think bishop f6 might be the most accurate move, thinking about it. Simply because we threaten this pawn, but also rook to f1 comes with much less of an issue now, because we can move our queen and f7 doesn't hang because my bishop is in the way. I don't see any other kind of knockout blow, and I think that this is probably the most accurate approach, because we not only apply pressure to one of the weaknesses in my opponent's position, but we also get rid of a lot of his potential counterplay. Okay, I didn't really expect that rook to move because I have queen h4, no? And I threaten h2. Or queen h3 maybe, but probably queen h2. So you have to go back and defend. And my opponent resigns, because if he goes back to defend, most likely I'm just going to take on d4, and white is losing everything now. He's forced to make some kind of trade, and let's say take, rook d1, I can just take here, and I mean, I have way too many pawns, white has very little counterplay. Very, very interesting game, and you don't often see this knight to g3 line in the Tartakower, but it does happen, and it is very much worth knowing how to play against it. Because we didn't play necessarily any main lines of the Caro Kann, this is kind of like a weird sideline where, you know, the computer says that it's completely equal, but we have to apply a slightly different variation of Caro Kann ideas because we can afford to be a bit more aggressive with the way my opponent played it. So I hope you guys enjoyed that, and let's jump into an analysis with the computer to see where we could have done better. Okay, so there's a couple moves in the analysis which I think you guys are going to find very interesting. Okay, we start off with d4, and I go c6. If my opponent plays a normal Queen's Gambit-esque position, then I will just play a Slav defense, but I like to play c6 first to allow my opponent to play the Caro Kann if he wants, which a lot of people do. A lot of people do like to play e4 after c6. If people want to play like a London setup, it also gives the option for queen to b6, which I to be honest, I consider like not a refutation, but as far as being in a good position after move 2 with the black pieces, this is really, really good. Really good. And a lot of people online will actually just go queen c1 and hang the d4 pawn as well, so that's also a benefit. But okay, my opponent goes back into a Caro, we go d5, and knight to c3. Like I mentioned, you can play the move g6 here, and if you want to see what happens after g6, then search up like on my channel like Chess Centurion Gurgenidze, spelt Gurgenidze. He's a grandmaster from I'm going to butcher the country, so I'm not even going to try. I can't even remember what country, but somewhere in Eastern Europe, I think. Maybe Poland. And this is a very interesting system. However, I know a lot of you like the Tartakower, so we played a Tartakower with knight to f6. And typically people take, and I mean, the position looks relatively equal. You could argue this is a bit of a drawish position, but there's also some subtleties to the position. Like after the move c3, most people will recommend the move bishop to d6. I, however, prefer the move bishop to f5. And I have a couple videos on my channel. There was like a part of a Caro Kann course that I did where I've recommended this line, and I personally love it. My opponent, though, dropped the knight back to g3. And this is just not particularly a good move. Now, as I mentioned, one of the pros of this move is, yes, you control the f5 square, but h5 is a bit of an issue. Now, most people do respond with h4, and here the computer actually likes the move c5, going after the pawn. If white takes, you're supposed to take, and go e6, which I mean, sure, I don't think it's really necessary to play c5 here, to be honest, though. After h4, I think moves like g6 are perfectly reasonable. I think bishop g4 is perfectly reasonable. I think you can probably play this in whatever manner you want. Even like queen c7 is a perfectly legitimate move. So I think you have a lot of flexibility here with the black pieces. My opponent, though, goes knight to f3. And of course, we should strike with h4, kicking the knight away, knight e2. And here the computer didn't like my move h3. Well, it did like it, but it preferred bishop to g4. Now, I thought that, okay, on h3 I can just take and ruin the structure. This is obviously good. However, I didn't like the prospect of knight to e5. I didn't want to give my bishop away. The computer here wants bishop to f5, which I mean, sure. But also, This just seems odd. I think... I'm not really sure what the point is. I mean, if the knight comes to c3, just wants to go knight bd7, e6, and develop normally, which, yeah, I guess. I suppose the point is, which, okay, to be fair, this does make sense. I was concerned about bishop g5 prospects and my pawn being vulnerable. However, here, of course, if bishop g5, I can just take on f3, removing one of the attackers. And if the knight comes to e5 and I drop the bishop back, then bishop g5 doesn't come with much venom because the knight isn't on f3 to target the pawn. And I suppose if I play a move like knight bd7 and the knight drops back to f3, here I have knight e4 apparently, and I can just not care about this pawn. If bishop takes, queen b6. Okay. A little bit convoluted, maybe. I thought that I quite liked my move of h3. Here, white, he doesn't have a great position, really. Practically, this is very hard to play. gh3. Bishop h3, of course. I was expecting my opponent to trade with me and play a move like knight to f4, kicking my rook away. Of course, I can't castle kingside, but I'll probably castle queenside anyway. And yes, this is a pretty good knight. Something like queen d3. g5 is the move the computer wants. Okay, I'm never going to play that. Knight to a6 looks a lot more natural. And this is just a fine position. Bishop d2, maybe knight c7. Maybe. Just protecting the d4 square. Queen c7 is also perfectly legitimate. But I think it makes way more sense for white to castle queenside, essentially. But my opponent doesn't do that. He goes knight g3, allowing me to take on f1. Taking with the king is the best move, but of course now his king is stranded on the king side. In this position, try and find the best move for the black pieces. Try and find it. Now, it's kind of similar to a move I mentioned earlier. Well, it is the exact move. It's c5. And if white takes, the queen hangs. I completely blanked on this. And I suppose the point is, if the bishop develops so the queen is now defended, the computer wants to take on d4, and if queen d4, knight c6, this is obviously a very good version of the position for black. King g2, computer wants knight d5, and this looks pretty good. You know, open h file, open d file, maybe we go f6, e5 at the correct moment to try and blunt this bishop. And the knights, you could argue, are a little bit awkward. However, I do like the idea of keeping the queens on the board from a human perspective, mainly because this king is going to be weak. As we saw in the game, it became incredibly weak. King g2, e6, computer preferred knight to a6. I think the point is it wants to get queenside castled immediately. And it prefers knight to a6 because it wants the rook on the open file, I think. I think that's the idea. Let's say bishop e3. Queenside castle. Yeah, this is fine. This is fine. But I go e6. Rook e1. Knight bd7. Queen d3. Here, I should be castling queenside immediately. And yeah, I mean, this is actually completely fine. c4. Queen a5. Bishop d2. Ah, okay. I can play bishop b4, but I can also just go queen c7. And on b4, bishop d6. So I play essentially the same line. This is pretty much what we got in the game. So I don't really understand what was wrong with the way I approached it. Bishop d6. Yeah, this is fine. Okay, if I'm missing some like intricacy that you guys are seeing, please let me know in the comments. But I thought this was perfectly reasonable. I mean, c5, I was going to meet with bishop to f4. This is actually an idea in the Vienna, obviously from the white side, but, you know, not quite in the same position, but the same concept of evacuating the bishop to your opponent's territory to offer a trade of bishops. And here, I mean, you know, because we control the d5 square so well, the pawn can never advance, and when I queenside castle, the pawn is going to be very weak, and everything is pointed towards the white king. So this should be a relatively comfortable position. My opponent, however, went bishop to d3. I did think d5 was the best option. And knight c5 does exist, but the computer prefers queenside castle, and if takes on e6, then knight c5. Okay, yeah, same concept. Queen e3, knight takes e6. We're potentially invading with the knights. This is set up very nicely. The d file and h files are open. The only reason this isn't losing for white completely is because there is queen takes a7. If that didn't exist, like let's say white put the queen on c2, then after knight e6, I think that we are clearly better in this position. However, my opponent went bishop to c3, and we castle queenside, the only move, because otherwise d5 is going to happen. My opponent goes knight g5, and yeah, I was going to play rook d to f8, but this is the best move. This is the best move in the position, and I'm really happy that I found this, because I like my rook on the d file. I don't really want to move it, because it makes it difficult for white to do anything with the pawns. Also, my knight isn't serving much of a purpose on the d7 square. It's like a superfluous knight, because it wants to go to f6, but f6 is already occupied. So after knight 5 to e4, take, queen takes. Of course, the knight can't take, because h2 hangs. Then we get the knight to g6, and this is the most powerful piece on the board, right? It takes us a couple of moves to get it into position, but because white is lacking shelter for his king, it's an incredibly powerful piece now. c5. Now, just to demonstrate how important the split pawns are for our attack, if I were to take here, watch the evaluation plummet. This is almost equal. Even with the weakness of the d-pawn, it's an incredibly weak pawn. This isn't even that good for us anymore, because white controls our infiltration squares. The knight is the reason our position is so good. Well, the knight in conjunction with the dysfunctionality of my opponent's kingside pawns, right? So just to demonstrate how important the broken structure is for our attack. My opponent goes b4, I go rook to h4, which is the best move, so very happy I find that. I was considering moves like knight to f4, but I'm like, okay, what's my plan? Again, rook h4 is the move the computer wants, so I'm going to have to play it at some point. I go rook h4, queen to f3. Here I considered the move rook h takes d4. Of course, if white takes, I have knight to h4 winning the queen, but white can just ignore me. And this is actually not amazing for me anymore. I still have to find knight to f4 to defend. King h1. I have to move, well, I have to go for this, and I mean, this is way too complicated. I would probably take white in this position, to be honest. So, rook d to h8, computer preferred rook to f4. What's the idea? Queen e3, knight h4, king g1. Okay, knight f3 wins the exchange if the king goes back here. Then it wants rook h8, preparing this, I suppose. However, I thought the way that we went about it was much more concrete, because I would argue the only move is rook h1. The computer suggests king to f1, just giving up the pawn, but what human plays that? Of course you're going to defend. And then after knight f4, okay, the computer wants this, queen e3. The best move here for black is queen d8. I think the point is to try and play queen to d5 check, but like, this is just unnecessarily complicated, right? Just play the obviously winning moves. At least that's my philosophy on this. Give the check. If the king goes to f1, I can just take here. Although this may not be the most accurate approach, the most accurate approach is queen d7. I don't know why. It just is, for some reason. I would just take here. And after the exchange, I know I'm clearly better. I'm up a pawn, the white king is stranded, my pieces are very well coordinated. Bishop to f6 is probably going to happen at some point, and this is just a very comfortable position. My opponent plays the more likely move, king to g1, trying to hold on to the pawn, but then we have knight h3, king moves, and rook to f4. And I mean, this is basically game over. If the queen tries to save herself and not take here, I mean, the attack is still coming. Computer wants bishop to h4. Not sure I would have played that, to be honest. Maybe bishop to f6 or... Well, no, okay, no, bishop g5 makes a lot of sense. I think this is probably what I would have played. Computer wants to trade the queens for white, and then, I mean, the position's clearly winning for the black pieces because we're up a pawn, and we're also positionally dominant. The e-pawn will probably fall, and the white king is stranded. So my opponent does give up the queen, but here we give the check. And I did consider queen to e3, trying to invade, but I couldn't find a good continuation after rook a to c1. Computer likes bishop to f6, also bishop to h4, which I did consider, going after the knight, also f5 to try and play f4, but I liked my plan of bishop to f6, because my thought process was, if my opponent plays rook a to f1, I can play queen to g4, threatening several infiltrations, as well as looking at the d4 pawn, and I couldn't find a way for white to defend this. There is simply no counterplay either. My opponent, of course, went rook h to f1, which makes my life much easier, because you have to bring the rook back, and then I will take on d4, and the game will be completely over, so my opponent in this position resigns. A very comfortable game. I think if you do play the Tartakower variation of the Caro Kann as well, you will encounter opponents that do go knight to g3, so it is very much worth knowing how to play against this, right? Because with the black pieces, you should be winning more than you're losing from this position, which, I mean, from move 5 with the black pieces, that's a very good situation to be in. If you want to see another very interesting Caro Kann game, then check out the video up here. And if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, check out the playlist down here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.